A faint whisper traveled through the desert night, barely audible yet impossible to ignore. It seemed to come from the very heart of the Nile, a voice as old as time itself. The protagonist paused, feeling a sudden chill in the air, the temperature dropping as if the winds themselves carried an unseen warning. The voice whispered of a curse, an ancient wrath tied to the goddess of the Nile. Fear crept up their spine, yet curiosity burned just as brightly. What was this curse? And who had disturbed it? The protagonist's hands trembled as they carefully brushed away the layers of sand, revealing a strange object beneath. It was a relic, ancient and worn by time. Intricate hieroglyphs glowed faintly under the moon's light, their meaning lost, but their power unmistakable. The relic seemed alive, humming with an energy that sent a shiver through the protagonist's body. The air around them felt heavier, charged with something unspoken. This was no ordinary find. Something about it felt significant, ominous, as if it was the key to something far greater and far darker than they could imagine. As the protagonist examined the relic, something shifted beneath the surface. The faint glow of the hieroglyphs grew stronger, revealing a hidden message carved into the stone. It was a prophecy, ancient and foreboding. The words spoke of a goddess, angered by the theft of her sacred artifact. A curse was unleashed, one that promised disaster to those who dared disturb her resting place. The protagonist's heart raced as they read the words, disbelief clouding their mind. Could this truly be real? Was this just a myth? Or had they stumbled upon something far more dangerous than they understood? A sudden gust of wind swept across the desert, making the protagonist's skin prickle. The air felt heavier, almost thick with tension, as though something unseen was stirring just out of sight. The relic hummed louder now, its eerie sound blending with the howl of the wind. The protagonist's gut tightened with unease. There was no visible source, but the weight in the air was unmistakable. It was as if the earth itself had shifted, and something far older than they could comprehend was watching, waiting, and now aware of their presence. The protagonist was not alone for long. An elder, draped in tattered robes, approached, his eyes filled with a quiet fear. "You must leave," the elder urged, his voice trembling with dread. "The goddess does not forgive those who disturb her relic." But the protagonist, eager to uncover the secrets of the Nile, brushed off the warning. The elder's eyes shone with unspoken knowledge, but they did not listen. The pull of discovery was too strong, and they knew they could not walk away now. Little did they know, they were about to awaken a force that would change everything. The golden desert stretched endlessly under the burning sun, its heat shimmering in the air. The earth seemed to pulse with life beneath the relentless sun, yet it was a harsh, unforgiving landscape. But there, cutting through the parched earth, was the mighty Nile River, glistening like a ribbon of life. Its waters flowed calmly, providing nourishment and hope to the land surrounding it. The Nile was the lifeblood of Egypt, contrasting sharply with the barren desert that surrounded it. In this vast land, where life and death coexisted, the river stood as a symbol of hope, its waters flowing through the soil, sustaining all who lived near its shores. The desert may have claimed much, but the Nile remained, steadfast and eternal, offering the promise of survival and prosperity. In the heart of Egypt stood the towering temples of Ra, the sun god. Massive stone columns reached toward the sky, each one carved with intricate hieroglyphs that told stories of the gods and the divine power that protected the land. The grandeur of the monuments was awe-inspiring, and the air around them was thick with reverence. People gathered here daily, offering prayers and sacrifices to Ra, seeking his favor and protection. The rituals performed inside these sacred walls were ancient, passed down through generations. As the sun began to set, long shadows stretched across the temple's grounds, casting an ethereal glow over the stone. The temple became even more mystical, bathed in the fading light. The reverence of the people, combined with the divine presence of Ra, filled the air with a sense of sacredness that could not be ignored. Beneath the golden sands of Egypt lay the tomb of a once powerful pharaoh, a ruler who had ruled with an iron fist. His reign had been one of fear and cruelty, his name whispered in fear long after his death. Now, buried beneath the earth, his curse remained. The pharaoh's legacy was one of misfortune. It was said that anyone who disturbed his tomb would be struck by the same fate that had befallen him, ruin and death. His greed had led him to betray those closest to him, and that betrayal had sealed his downfall. Though he was dead, his curse lived on, haunting the land. The whispers of his evil deeds and tragic end lingered in the shadows, passed from one generation to the next. The pharaoh's tomb was a place of power, but it was also a place of darkness. Those who sought to uncover its secrets would find themselves at the mercy of a curse that had no mercy. Among the people who lived in the shadow of the temples, there was one who was chosen by the gods, the priestess of Isis. She was a woman of extraordinary beauty and wisdom, revered by the people for her deep connection to the divine. The gods had selected her to maintain the balance between the divine and mortal worlds, to ensure that harmony was kept and the ancient powers were respected. Each day, she performed sacred ceremonies, invoking the protection of Isis to preserve the land's peace. Her hands moved gracefully as she chanted the ancient prayers, her voice soft but powerful. Yet beneath her calm exterior, a storm raged within her. She struggled with the weight of her role, questioning whether the god's will was always just. The burden of holding the balance between two worlds was heavy, and sometimes she wondered if her actions had consequences beyond what she could control. The choices she made could either save or doom her people. The pharaoh's curse had begun to stir once again, and the land trembled beneath its awakening. The protagonist, caught in the turmoil of fate, now had no choice but to confront the ancient powers that had been disturbed. The curse was not just a story or an old tale, it was real, and it was threatening to destroy everything the priestess and others held dear. The skies darkened, and the Nile's waters began to shift unnaturally, a sign that the goddess's wrath was nearing. But there was more to the story. A rival faction, hungry for power, had learned of the curse and sought to control the Nile's divine force for their own gain. This faction posed a greater threat than the curse itself, as their desire to harness the power of the gods could plunge the entire land into chaos. The stakes were higher than ever, and the path ahead was filled with danger, uncertainty, and an impending battle between the forces of light and dark. The protagonist's fingers traced the worn hieroglyphs on the relic, feeling a strange heat emanating from the stone. Each symbol seemed to pulse under their touch, as if the relic itself was alive. The deeper they read, the more they understood. This was no ordinary artifact. It was a key to an ancient prophecy, one tied to the goddess of the Nile. As the last hieroglyph was deciphered, the relic suddenly began to glow with a faint, otherworldly light. The air thickened, and the ground beneath the protagonist's feet vibrated, as though the earth itself was awakening. A cold shiver ran through them as they realized the power they had uncovered. The goddess's wrath was real, and her ability to control the Nile's waters was a force beyond their comprehension. This relic was far more than a simple object. It was a tool of unimaginable power, and with it, they had disturbed something far greater than they could have ever imagined. The priestess of Isis, deep in her sacred temple, felt a sudden surge of divine energy. Her heart raced as the vision from the gods swept over her. In her mind's eye, the waters of the Nile began to rise, crashing violently against the land, destroying everything in its path. The goddess's voice echoed in her ears, cryptic and filled with wrath. "He who awakens the relic shall face my fury," the goddess warned. The vision was filled with flashes of destruction, villages swallowed by floods, crops turning to dust, and the sky darkening with storm clouds. The priestess stood frozen, torn between her duty and her fear. The prophecy she had heard since childhood now seemed more real than ever, and the burden of the gods' will pressed heavily on her shoulders. She knew that if the relic's power was unleashed, the destruction would be unstoppable. Yet, a part of her yearned to find a way to stop it, to protect her people from the devastation that was surely coming. News of the relic's discovery spread like wildfire, reaching the ears of a powerful warlord, hungry for control of Egypt's divine forces. Was quick to act. They knew that with the relic, they could command the power of the goddess herself. As they moved to seize the artifact, the protagonist's group, unaware of the growing threat, found themselves in the heart of the sacred temple of Ra. The confrontation was inevitable. The sacred temple, once a place of peace and reverence, was now a battlefield. Tensions escalated quickly as both sides fought for control of the relic. The air crackled with intensity, and every blow struck was like a challenge to the gods themselves. The rival faction pushed forward with relentless force, seeking to take the relic by any means necessary. The protagonist's group fought back with all their strength, but they were outnumbered. As the battle raged on, strange signs began to appear. The ground trembled slightly, and distant thunder rumbled in the sky, though the day was clear. It was as though the gods themselves were watching, waiting, and the first signs of divine intervention began to manifest. The protagonist, caught in the chaos, realized that this battle was no longer just about the relic, was about the fate of Egypt itself. The battle raged on, and just as it seemed that victory was within reach for one side, the earth shook violently. A piercing, unnatural wind swept through the temple, knocking everyone off their feet. The air grew cold, and the skies above darkened with swirling clouds. The goddess of the Nile had awakened. From the river below, a great flood began to rise, surging higher and higher, as if the goddess herself were angry. The once calm waters roared with fury, crashing against the temple walls. The ground shook beneath the feet of the combatants, and the air hummed with raw power. The protagonist looked up, horrified, as the water began to creep toward them, as though it recognized them as the cause of the destruction. The goddess's voice boomed, echoing through the temple. "Mortals who awaken what was meant to sleep shall know my wrath," she declared. The force of her presence was overwhelming. The winds howled, and the temple seemed to groan under the weight of the goddess's anger. The protagonist, unable to move, realized with growing fear that they had unleashed something far beyond their control. The divine power was now real, and there was no turning back. The goddess was exacting her revenge, and the price for disturbing her sacred relic would be paid in full. The wrath of the goddess had been unleashed, and the land began to pay the price. The once thriving fields that bordered the Nile began to wither and die. Crops turned to dust as the ground dried up, unable to sustain life any longer. The river, once a life-giving force, now receded, leaving the land barren. The people of Egypt, terrified and helpless, watched in horror as the very lifeblood of their land disappeared. Illness spread rapidly, and the air grew thick with despair. The protagonist, standing in the middle of the chaos, felt the weight of their actions crashing down on them. It was their curiosity, their desire to uncover the secrets of the relic, that had brought this upon their people. Guilt and fear gnawed at them as they realized that the curse was real, and they had set it in motion. The divine powers had been disturbed, and now the land, the people, and everything they had known were paying the price. The protagonist could feel the goddess's anger like a fire burning at their core, and they knew that time was running out. The curse was spreading, and only they could stop it, but how? Just when it seemed the protagonist's group couldn't face more betrayal, it happened. One of their closest allies, a trusted friend, stepped forward. Their eyes gleamed not with loyalty, but with cold calculation. "I was never on your side," the betrayer revealed, a cruel smile spreading across their face. The shock hit like a thunderclap, and the protagonist's heart sank. The ally had been working with the rival faction all along, feeding them information, guiding them to the relic. The revelation tore through the group like a knife to the heart. The protagonist, already grappling with the consequences of their own decisions, now faced this painful truth. The betrayal was personal, it was a wound deeper than any physical blow. As the protagonist's world crumbled around them, they had to fight not only the external forces, but now also the treachery within their ranks. The enemy, both outside and inside their own circle, was too powerful to fight alone. Their trust had been shattered, and now they had to face the harsh reality that their actions had drawn them into a web of deceit that they could no longer untangle. The prophecy, long whispered in the temples, had now come to life. The goddess's power was growing stronger by the minute, and the land itself was shifting in response. Floods ravaged the villages, the very soil beneath the protagonist's feet, trembling as if it could no longer support the weight of the curse. Ominous omens appeared in the sky-dark clouds, swirling unnaturally. Strange birds circling above, and the temperature plummeting with no warning. The protagonist watched in terror as these signs confirmed their worst fears. The curse was not just a warning, it was a force that could end the world. The goddess had risen, and now Egypt was paying the price for disturbing her resting place. The protagonist, with the weight of their guilt heavy on their shoulders, knew that their actions had led to this destruction. The final pieces of the prophecy were falling into place, and there was no escaping the consequences. The world was on the brink of collapse, and the protagonist, realizing the scope of their mistakes, prepared for what was coming next. The skies above Egypt darkened, turning from a bright blue to an ominous shade of gray. The clouds gathered quickly, swirling above the Nile like a massive storm ready to strike. The wind howled, carrying with it the first signs of the goddess's wrath. As the storm raged in the heavens, the waters of the Nile began to rise, threatening to engulf the land. The protagonist, standing with their allies on the temple steps, felt the weight of the prophecy heavy on their shoulders. They knew the storm was no coincidence. The goddess's anger was real, and it was directed at them. Fear gripped their heart as the earth trembled beneath their feet. The storm grew fiercer with each passing moment, lightning flashing across the sky, illuminating the darkened temple. In that moment, the protagonist realized the true cost of their actions. The curse was no longer just a story. It was happening, and they had no choice but to face it head-on. The battle for the relic had come to a head in the sacred temple of Ra. The protagonist, along with their group, faced off against the rival faction in the heart of the temple. Both sides were determined to control the relic, but the stakes were higher than they ever imagined. The ground beneath them seemed to shake with the power of the gods as their fight escalated. The temple, once a place of peace and worship, now felt like a battleground. The protagonist's mind raced, torn between protecting the relic and grappling with the guilt of having unleashed the goddess's wrath. Each clash of weapons, each shout of defiance, felt like an affront to the divine. The storm outside intensified, its fury reflected in the chaos inside the temple. Flashes of lightning lit the scene, casting long shadows across the stone walls. The protagonist's heart pounded in their chest, knowing that no matter who won this battle, the goddess's power was growing stronger with every passing second. The storm outside reached its peak, and the earth beneath the temple trembled violently. Without warning, the goddess of the Nile fully manifested, her wrath taking form in the very waters of the river. The Nile began to rise uncontrollably, surging toward the temple, threatening to swallow everything in its path. The protagonist and their allies were caught between their duty to protect the land and the goddess's fury. The water surged through the temple gates, flooding the sacred grounds as the goddess's anger filled the air. Lightning crackled across the sky, and the storm's winds whipped through the temple's stone columns. The goddess's voice boomed, echoing with the power of the Nile itself, warning the mortals who had dared to disturb her peace. The protagonist, their heart heavy with guilt, knew that the world they had once known was slipping away. They had unleashed the goddess's wrath, and now they must find a way to undo the damage before the land was lost to the floodwaters forever. In the midst of the storm and chaos, the protagonist's hands trembled as they uncovered the final secret hidden within the relic. A hidden inscription, previously unreadable, now glowed with an eerie light. The words spoke of a forbidden truth. The only way to break the curse and calm the goddess's rage was through a sacrificial act. The goddess demanded the ultimate price, a life, a personal loss that would forever alter the course of the land. The revelation struck the protagonist like a blow to the chest. They had thought they could stop the curse by simply returning the relic, but the goddess's demands were far greater than they had imagined. The emotional weight of the decision hit them like a tidal wave. They would have to choose someone dear to them, someone they loved, to give up their life in order to restore balance and save Egypt. The cost of the prophecy was more than the protagonist had ever been prepared for. The storm raged around them, the waters of the Nile rising higher with each passing moment. The protagonist stood frozen, the weight of the revelation heavy on their heart. But then, someone stepped forward, a character close to the protagonist, someone they loved and trusted. With unwavering resolve, this person offered themselves, ready to make the ultimate sacrifice. "I will do it," they said, their voice filled with a mixture of love and sorrow. The protagonist's heart shattered as they realized the true cost of their journey. The storm seemed to pause, holding its breath, as the sacrifice was made. The temple, the storm, and the goddess herself watched as the selfless act unfolded. As the life was given, the waters of the Nile began to recede, and the storm slowly abated. The goddess's wrath had been quelled, but the price was steep. The protagonists knelt beside the fallen, their tears mingling with the rain that now fell gently around them. The storm was over, but the emotional toll was just beginning. The storm had finally passed, but the emotional devastation remained. The temple, once filled with chaos and fear, now stood in silence. The Nile's waters, though calmer, still carried the weight of the sacrifice. The protagonist stood alone in the sacred temple, the remnants of the storm still hanging in the air. The sacrifice had appeased the goddess, but the cost was more than they could bear. The curse had been broken, the land saved. But at what price? The protagonist's eyes lingered on the lifeless body of their friend, the one who had given everything to restore balance. Guilt and grief threatened to consume them as they knelt beside the fallen. The world around them seemed to blur, the triumph of their actions overshadowed by the loss. Yet, in the midst of their sorrow, a glimmer of hope remained. The land would heal, the curse was gone, and Egypt's future could begin anew. But the emotional scars of the journey would remain forever. The storm had passed, leaving behind an eerie stillness. The once turbulent waters of the Nile now flowed gently, its surface reflecting the soft glow of the setting sun. The air was thick with silence, as if the land itself was breathing a sigh of relief. The protagonists stood at the edge of the river, their heart heavy with the weight of the choices they had made. The calm that surrounded them felt like both peace and loss. They looked out over the water, thinking of the sacrifices that had brought them here, and the long journey they had endured to find this moment of fragile serenity. The protagonist knelt beside their fallen friend, the weight of grief settling in their chest. They had given everything to stop the goddess's wrath, and now the price had been paid. A quiet tear slid down the protagonist's cheek as they whispered their final goodbyes. The air felt thick with sorrow, yet also with a strange sense of understanding. The protagonist had learned that some things were more important than survival of, sacrifice, and the responsibility that came with power. They touched their friend's hand one last time, silently acknowledging the irreversible consequences of their actions. In this moment, the protagonist understood the true meaning of their mission: to protect, even at the cost of everything they held dear. As the last echoes of the storm faded, the goddess's presence lingered. In the stillness, the protagonist felt the weight of divine wisdom settle over them. The goddess of the Nile, once furious, now spoke in a voice that resonated through the air. "Power is both a gift and a curse," she said, her words like a soft whisper in the wind. To wield it is to understand responsibility, to respect balance. For every gift, there is a price. The words held deep meaning, echoing through the protagonist's heart. They now understood the importance of harmony between the divine and mortal realms, a lesson they would carry with them forever. With the goddess's wrath calmed and the storm gone, the protagonist set to work, ensuring that balance was restored to the kingdom. The Nile's waters slowly returned to their former strength, bringing life back to the parched land. The crops began to grow once more, and the people rejoiced, their faith in the gods renewed. But even in the midst of their celebrations, there was a quiet reverence. The cost of their salvation was understood, and the protagonist worked in the background, their mind reflecting on how far they had come and how they had changed in the process. The protagonist stood alone on the riverbank, the legacy of their journey heavy on their shoulders. They had faced impossible choices and unimaginable consequences, and now the world they had saved would remember them. But more than the legend of their actions, the protagonist knew that they had changed. Their understanding of life, death, and power had evolved. They had learned that true strength lay in sacrifice, and that peace was often forged through struggle. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the protagonist felt the weight of their legacy, knowing that their story would live on in the annals of Egyptian mythology, forever revered.